All right, I have a question for you guys. Are you ready for this question? It's not actually a question you got to answer, but I'm curious. Have you guys ever started a movie or a book that really didn't make sense in the beginning, but then once you got to the end, everything like clicked, right? Have you guys ever been there? You've read a book, you've watched a movie that's kind of happened to you? Yeah, right? Maybe it was like a random detail of a scene early on that became really important later that you had no idea was going to be important. It's kind of like if you ever like watch those like really cheesy rom-coms, it's like the like little quirk that the like girl has to where she like always trips over things, and then like in the love story or she like loves black coffee and things like that, and then like when the guy is like confessing to the girl, he's like, I just love that you're clumsy and you love black coffee and blah blah blah, and you're like, that was such a minuscule detail of this entire story, right? Sorry, I just think it's so weird that they do that. Anyways, don't get me started on cheesy romantic comedies, guys. Moving on. Guys, the best stories usually have something more going on than what we could see, right? It's why we're in this series and why it's called More to the Story. Because good stories draw us in, right? They keep us wondering what's going to happen next and inspire us to want more of that story. And so, friends, in this series, we're going to be looking at the best story, a story that is worth knowing and retelling, and that's God's story. But guys, I kind of think it had a surprisingly cute and good ending, right? I loved that. It said that they remembered even in the messiest, goofiest, coldest moments, God is still writing a good story. Aww, that's cute. But guys, I think it goes to show that stories can take twists and turns and still be good, even when they're very unpredictable, right? And that's also true of God's story. Sometimes it's hard to believe that God is writing a good story, especially when sometimes in our lives don't feel very good. Or maybe when we look around in the world and we see bad things are happening in it, and we're like, where is God's story good in this? But what we're going to be talking about tonight is that from the very beginning of the Bible, we see something really important. We see that God's story starts with goodness. And the really good thing about God's story is that it's still going on today. And so in order for us to understand this, we really need to start back to the beginning. And I mean the very first page of the Bible that we're going to be starting with. So who can tell me what the first book of the Bible is? Genesis. We are starting in Genesis, and I really feel like this book sets up the foundation to really understand the Bible and God's heart for the world. And so we're going to be reading through and talking about a couple different sections of this first chapter of the Bible. And we see that it's packed with purpose, and we could really see just how intentional and loving that God really is. And so we're going to check out a couple of parts of the first couple of sentences of chapter 1. So let's go ahead and check this out. So it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. So what we see here, now before I keep on going, I just have to preface this. We are not today talking about whether the creation story is actually accurate, historically accurate or not. We're just talking about the important parts of the story. Because were you guys there at the beginning of time? Yes, no, we were not there, so we don't know. So we just have to go off of what this story teaches us, the moral aspects of it. So with that aside, have that in your head. But what we see from this story is it's telling us that before anything existed, there was emptiness and chaos. Yet what happened was God recognized its potential and possibilities before, even in that vast emptiness. So I don't know about you guys, but I definitely know that there has been points in my life where I found myself amidst chaos, that I have found myself feeling a sense of emptiness, or maybe walking in a season that has felt really, really dark. Right? And that's sometimes what can happen in our lives. Things can happen to where it feels chaotic, or it feels empty, or it feels dark. But what we could see from the scripture, even in the first couple of sentences, this is only for 4 verses in to the entire Bible, we could see so much of it because the very first thing God created was what? light, right? And when the light pierced the darkness, God stopped and he celebrated what was good. And he called the light good. And so this beginning part shows us that there is goodness. It shows us that there's goodness even in the difficult parts of our story. And it shows us that God brings light to our darkness, right? And the beautiful thing is that the story doesn't stop here, right, with just the light, right? Because what does God do in this story? God keeps on going and celebrating all of the good in creation that he creates every single day. He creates and forms the sky. He creates and forms oceans and mountains and animals and plants. And every single item, God said it was good, right? Not perfect, not flawless, but good. God created the world and everything in it with intentionality, care, and goodness. And the story doesn't just end with those animals, right? It doesn't just end with the oceans and the sea creatures and the mountains and the trees, because there's one more thing that God creates in this creation story. What is the next thing that God creates? Us, humans. God creates us. And the important thing about this is that God specifically said that God creates us in God's own image. And then what does God say about humans? He says this time that this creation, us, was very good. Very good. Because then, you know what that means? That means when God sees you, God says, you are very good. You were created to reflect God's character. When we say that you were created in God's own image, we mean that you were created to have hope and express love and have peace and have creativity just like God does. That's what God's character is. God's story didn't end with creation. It's still unfolding because you guys are here today because God created us and we are still happening. Babies are still going on in the world, right? That's how we know the story isn't over, because you are a part of it. And now the question is, maybe you might be thinking like what I thought of when I first kind of started wrestling with this talk is that, okay, but that doesn't match what I see around me, right? Because there is pain in this world. There's injustice. There are hard things in my life and the world, and that's really real. But I'm going to give you an example that is a really weird example. You're going to have to hang in here with me, okay? Are you ready for this really weird example? I have a question for you guys. Have you ever seen lately, I don't actually know if this is a recent trend, but have you guys seen the Hot Cheeto Challenge on TikTok? Did anybody see that? Okay. Did you, Jose? Oh. Okay, I'm not going to lie, neither did I, but when I heard this analogy, I thought it was genius. So for everybody, all of us that never saw this challenge, the challenge was to eat an entire bag of hot Cheetos within 60 seconds. Megan, you said you could do that? Okay. Now the question is, what does the Hot Cheeto Challenge have to do with what we're talking about tonight? Let me explain this to you. Hear me out. So when people do this challenge, right, I'm assuming, and I can imagine that they get really thirsty after this because their mouth is on fire. They just ate a bunch of dry Cheetos, right? And so they probably need water or milk or something afterwards. And so what they're showing us in that moment is that their thirst points to something that can quench it. What I mean by that is that their thirst points to a solution, right? So they're thirsty, so they need water. And this is similar to another longing that we have. Because let me ask you this. Have you guys ever seen hurt and pain in our world and thought, what if we had a better world? You hoped there has to be something better out there, right? You have seen pain and hurt in the world. You have seen bad things, and you're like, there has to be something better, right? So guys, just like our thirst points to a desire for water, our deep longing for a better world points to the fact that a better world can and does exist. And so what I mean by this is just like the people doing the Hot Cheetos Challenge, they remembered a point in their life to where their mouths weren't on fire, right? They remembered a better point in their life. Their thirst was an indicator that the thing they were experiencing was not the way their body was made to be. And that's why they needed that water. And so when we read the story of Genesis, if we go through that entire first chapter and we read through it all, we see the world that God desires us to live in. One filled with goodness, connection, beauty, and honestly, most importantly, a life-sustaining relationship with the God who made it all. So our longing of a better world indicates that there's more to the story here. And we could see this all over the Bible, especially in the Psalms. So there's this beautiful Psalm 104. I'm not going to read it because it's like 34 verses long and we'll get really bored if I'm being honest, because it'd just be me reading to you. You guys, I highly recommend reading it because it's a really good chapter, but it'd take a long time to read. But it's a poem written by someone in awe of creation. And so at this point in the story, if we've read through the Bible, we know that after the creation story, Adam and Eve were created. And what happens is that sin enters the world because they eat the apple. We're going to talk about that next week. We're not going to get into that this week. But we see that evil enters the world. And there's bad things that end up happening. And so at this point, the people in the Psalms know that there is bad stuff that happens in the world. And yet, this author is writing a poem in awe of creation, still believing in God's goodness, even after everything turned upside down and there was evil in the world, and they knew about it. Guys, the writer praises how every detail of nature, from the oceans to the mountains to the wild animals, is still good and still cared for by God. And so in Psalms 27:13, which is written by King David, and if you know anything about King David's story, you know that his story is not rainbows and butterflies. He had bad things happen in his life. He had someone trying to kill him. He made a lot of mistakes. Things were not great, and yet he still writes this. After all of that happens in his life, after he walks through darkness, he walks through chaos, he walks maybe through emptiness sometimes, he says this: I remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Friends, I think that is a really bold thing to say when life is hard, right? But it's a reminder for us. It's a reminder that the earth may have been formed however long ago. We're not going to debate that. Millions and millions of years ago, I believe, trillions of years ago. I don't really know how long it was built. I haven't done science in a really long time. A long time ago, right? Even though the earth was formed that long ago, it does not mean that God's not done creating. Guys, God is still at work in the world today to create and provide and restore and bring renewal through us, because God is still writing a good story. Guys, God is writing a good story. It all started with God's loving presence and intentionality. Each day, God created something good, and the grand finale was you, that he called very good. And so I feel like with so many disappointing and discouraging things happening all around us, it could be really challenging for us to see that good, right? We're going to talk about that next week. But I want us to get started on a positive note here in this series. I want us to have a couple of things that we could take away and start doing right now this week to connect to the good story that God is writing in our world right now. And so the first thing I want us to remember is to remember what's good. So friends, I want you to think back to a time to when you really felt God's presence. Maybe it was at camp. Maybe it was at last year's mission trip. Maybe it was when you went on a hike with your family. Or maybe it was just during a time when someone really showed up for you. Guys, what I want you to do is I want you to remember that time. I want you to write it down somewhere so you do remember it, you don't forget it. And then I want you to thank God for it, because that right there is a reminder that God is still writing a good story. And then the second thing is I want you guys to actually focus on what's good. Guys, there's a lot of negativity happening in our world right now, and it's easy, really easy. Even I get victim of this, of it being overwhelming to feel all of the brokenness that is happening around us, right? But if you look closely, there is still good happening, because God is still weaving goodness into the fabric of our world. And when you start looking for it, you're going to start finding it. Like, have you ever kind of done that experiment with yourself if you are like, okay, red cars. I'm going to think about red cars, right? You're on the road, and then all of a sudden, it's like all of the red cars come out of the woodworks, right? It's an actual like psychological scientific phenomenon, right? So when I start actually thinking of good things, I'm going to start noticing good things are happening in my life. And so that's why I want you to focus on those good things, because when you start focusing and seeing it, you're going to focus on it more and see it more in your life. Maybe this is in your family, in your school, in your friend group. Maybe it's through all of the nonprofits that we get to work through as a part of being this church, of being part of this church. That is God's goodness breaking through. And then the last thing is to trust that God is making everything good again. Guys, what are your hopes for the world? What do you want to see changed, to see healed, or maybe even renewed? When you guys see a story in the news or hear about a situation that makes you angry or frustrated or sad, I want you guys to remember that those things are indicators that a good world can exist. Because you're saying there is something that's not right about this situation. The world isn't as it should be, and that means that there's a better world that it can be. And so when those moments of frustration arise, I want you to take out your phone and I want you to write it down on a page in a journal, and I want you to pray with God and ask how you can be a part of helping make that better world together. Friends, when we remember God's goodness in the past, it actually helps us recognize the goodness to come in the future, and the goodness in right now. And so this week, I want you guys to go somewhere and be with people who bring goodness into your life, to remind you what's good. So just like our thirst signals a presence of water, or our hunger proves that food exists, right? Our yearning for a better world suggests that a better world is actually possible. And so remember that God is writing a good story, and that you are a part of that good story, and that he calls you very good. Even when life feels messy, hard, or confusing, I want you guys to remember the beginning of God's story was full of light and goodness, and that same goodness is still echoing through your life today.